Welcome to the writer's review of Dungeonborn by Dakota Krout. We'll start out the review as always with the main spoiler-free section, then we'll move on to a short summary of the first few chapters of the book, and lastly finish off with some lessons that the writers among you can take away from this novel. So, Dungeonborn is the first installment in the Divine Dungeon series. This series currently consists of 5 books, with the newest one having been released this past May. It's a fantasy series through and through, featuring elves, dwarves, various magical elements, and plenty of borrowed tropes from tabletop RPGs and their video game counterparts. It has multiple point of view characters, 2 of which drive the majority of the plot. The perspective of one of these is narrated from the first person's perspective and in the past tense, while all the others are done in the same tense but in the third person. As to what you can expect from the story, the first several chapters are dedicated only to one of the main characters, who isn't your typical flesh and blood protagonist. Throughout these chapters, the character learns about who he is, his powers, his goals, and how he fits into the wider world. Only once these ground rules are firmly established and the character reaches a minimum level of competency does this novel's plot really begin. New characters get introduced, all of whom are in a way in direct conflict with this primary character. The rest of the novel then consists of a race of arms and intellect between these two opposing sides as to who can best the other, and in doing so ascend the ranking system of this fictional world. The 3 main subgenres which make up this novel are philosophical, action, and drama. The philosophical elements are featured so heavily because of this novel's spirituality system, which ties into many of its world's mechanics, such as its magic system. It's based somewhat on the belief systems of the Far East, with an emphasis on bioenergy, and throughout this novel we follow the 2 main characters as they encounter the benefits and requirements of these for the very first time from their own unique points of view. Since combat is almost directly tied into the progression through this world's spiritual ranking system, you can expect to find long segments of action scattered throughout this novel. Most of it is in the vein of brave adventurers going into deep dark places in search of loot and glory, and since the 2 main protagonists make up the 2 sides of this coin, the author often jumps between their 2 viewpoints throughout a single engagement, making you conflicted as to which side you want to see win. Apart from the dialogue required to keep a narration going, most of the novel's drama is contained to only one of the 2 main characters. This is mostly to do with the social and political intrigue, which comes along with someone who has newly acquired wealth, power, and land. Alongside these main elements, you can also expect to find quite a bit of comedy livening up the story, as well as quite a bit of world building, but since most of this story is contained to one geographic location, this is mostly focused on the world's spirituality and magic systems. As to other traits you might find interesting, the audiobook narrator's energetic portrayal of one of the 2 main characters can be a bit jarring at first, but after a few chapters, it really grows on you. So if you've listened to the short excerpt on Audible, don't let the narrator's voice scare you away from this novel. The novel's magic system, which I've mentioned several times by now, is also somewhat original and quite refreshing to read about. The powers themselves aren't completely new per se, but the way they are introduced and how they tie into the combat is different enough to make it feel fresh. The novel also features quite lengthy descriptions of Frankenstein-style experimentations, which are oddly somewhat believable. These experiments often lead to quite amusing results, such as literal killer bunnies, and if that by itself isn't enough to sell you on this novel, then frankly I don't know what will. In conclusion, Dungeonborn is available in ebook, paperback, and audiobook formats. I originally got this book on a whim in an Audible 2-for-1 deal because I needed to pick another book alongside the one I really wanted, but ironically I ended up liking this one more than the other one. It's also got good ratings across all the different sites. Although I am surprised that despite being such a good read, it has so few of them compared to the other books I covered on this channel. In terms of length, it falls in the 110,000 word range, and the audiobook comes in at 12.5 hours long. In terms of pricing, the Kindle version is the cheapest by far, as usual, although the audiobook version with the WhisperSync deal comes in at $15, so you might as well use up your Audible credit to get this book if you don't need the ebook version. As always, prices might change in the future, so I will have Amazon links in the description down below. Now I'll be going into some of the content at the beginning of the novel, so if you want to avoid all the spoilers, I suggest you click off the video now. So, the story starts out with the main character dying and his soul getting captured inside a soul gem by a necromancer. Moments later, the necromancer is slain and the gem falls out of his hand and tumbles into a nearby cave. When the stone settles at the bottom of a puddle, Cal, the protagonist, loses all memory of his past life and begins to explore the nature of his new existence. Soon he is contacted by another of his kind and sent a wisp to aid him. From her, he learns that he is in fact a dungeon and that his purpose in life is to grow and gain energy by enticing adventurers to explore his depths and killing them with monsters and traps that he can create. As soon as he creates a rudimentary set of mobs and traps, a local group of sheep herders comes exploring. Cal manages to take them out, all except one. Dale, the sole survivor, seeing the opportunity of a lifetime, sells the information of the newly discovered dungeon to the Adventurers Guild and is quickly pulled into the adventurer's lifestyle. Plenty more happens later on in the novel, but if you want to find out more, you're just gonna have to go out and get the book for yourself and read it. Now for the lesson section of this video. The first thing I'd like to point out is that at the very beginning of the book, the first chapter only contains one character. Now obviously, this severely limits the storytelling tools available to the author, especially in terms of exposition through dialogue. Since she can't make use of dialogue, the author makes extensive use of introspective monologues in these sections to break up the constant description of Cal's environment and actions. This is further aided by the choice of a first-person's perspective point of view narration. Dennis E. Taylor, in my opinion, also makes use of these exact same techniques to a similar effect in the first Bobiverse book. Another similarity between the two books is that neither of them tries to keep their main character isolated throughout the entire length of the novel. Instead, both authors quickly add a support character in the shape of Guppy in the Bobiverse series and Danny in the Divine Dungeon series. Although Danny is, in comparison to Guppy, a far less superficial character and also plays a more important and active part in the series plot. Another thing to take away from this novel is how even simple alterations to already established tropes in a genre can differentiate your novel from its peers. For instance, this novel uses many fantasy elements such as mana, dwarves, elves, magical abilities, elemental affinities, and dungeons to name a few, but then it alters these in very slight ways. For instance, the elves are still a wise and long-living civilization, but here their reproduction is tied to the silverwood trees. Mana in essence are a limited resource, but instead of being a constantly regenerating pool of energy used for spells and such, they are directly tied to cultivation and to one's life force, and can then consequently lead to death if overused. Cultivators have elemental affinities, which determines the powers they can use, but at the same time limits them to cultivate only in dungeons with the same affinities as theirs. Dungeons are the main place where adventurers can fight mobs and advance in rankings, but here the advancement in ranking isn't tied directly to combat, but rather to the time spent meditating inside the dungeons themselves. Dungeons are also not the stereotypical ruins of ancient civilizations, but rather sentient creatures who just happen to gain power by the people who die inside them. These small changes to the world rules by themselves help to differentiate the novel, but they can also tie together to form more complex, unique developments. For instance, the introduction of Rose's character ties together essence as a life force, elemental affinities, and the prosecution of infernal and celestial dungeons. These all come together in her getting forcibly raised into the D rankings by Madame Chandra for her survival, but still remaining relatively inexperienced as an adventurer by the point she joins Dale's group despite her high rankings. Well, that wraps up my review on Dungeonborn. I hope you found this video entertaining and at least a bit informative. Feel free to leave a comment down below and check out one of my previous videos, and I'll see you on the next review.